I was looking forward to tonight. My plan was simple: an action movie and a couple of cold beers with my brother Lucas. At 42, I cherish these uncomplicated evenings, moments of relaxation in the midst of our chaotic lives. Lucas, being 45, has always been the steady rock in our duo, someone I could count on for good times and deep conversations alike. We had arranged to meet at the cinema, a familiar old theater that seemed to welcome us back every time we needed an escape. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Just as we were about to step into the dim glow of the movie hall, Lucas's phone buzzed urgently. I caught a glimpse of the worry etched on his face as he answered. His voice, usually so calm and assured, wavered with concern as he spoke. Within moments, I learned that his wife had called him in a panic. Apparently, their child had taken a turn for the worse and was now seriously ill. I felt the shift immediately. The idea of sitting alone in the dark cinema, surrounded by laughter and thrilling on-screen explosions, now seemed strangely hollow. I knew how much Lucas was needed at home, and in that moment, his absence wasn't just a physical gap. It was a void where shared moments should have been. The plan we had so eagerly looked forward to had been abruptly unraveled by circumstances beyond our control. I didn't want to face the movie on my own, with the familiar thrill now tarnished by worry and a gnawing sense of abandonment. Instead of waiting around or trying to salvage the evening at the theater, I made a snap decision. Without a word to my wife, I turned around and headed home. I knew that lying about my whereabouts would only complicate things later, but the loneliness of an empty theater was far more unbearable than the worry I anticipated at home. That drive back was a quiet one. The city lights blurred through my rearview mirror as I replayed the events in my head. It was a strange feeling, abandoning plans, feeling a twinge of guilt, and yet also relieved to avoid that awkward solitude. I wondered what Lucas must be going through, juggling panic and parental duty in the blink of an eye. And as the night deepened around me, I couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted. A subtle fracture in the routine that promised to change the course of my evening, and perhaps even more. By the time I reached my front door, the weight of the decision had settled. I knew there'd be questions later, explanations that might sound half-hearted and contrived. But for now, I just needed the comfort of home, a place to regroup and, hopefully, to find the strength to face whatever came next. When I stepped into the house, something immediately caught my attention. A heady scent that wasn't mine, not in the slightest. It was a rich, expensive fragrance, the kind of men's cologne you'd pay $300 for. I hadn't touched anything like that in years, and yet here it was, hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. My eyes scanned the dimly lit living room and landed on a peculiar scene. 2 glasses of wine and an open bottle that must have cost at least $150, its contents glinting under the soft light. The whole setup was meticulously arranged, as if someone had been trying to create the perfect, luxurious evening. But the lingering aroma of that costly cologne twisted the scene into something far more unsettling. My gaze shifted to the sofa, where I noticed a sleek, luxury brand men's jacket draped casually next to it. I didn't recognize it at all. There was no way Lucas or I owned something so extravagant. And yet there it was, a silent reminder that something was amiss. Every instinct in my body screamed that I wasn't alone, that someone had been here, and not just any someone, but someone with a taste for the finer things in life. The nagging feeling of unease grew until it was impossible to ignore. I knew I had to investigate further. My feet led me almost involuntarily towards the bedroom, each step echoing in the quiet of the house. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, half expecting to see a visitor or some clue that could explain the mystery. The bedroom was dim, its shadows hiding most of its secrets. Yet, even in the low light, it was clear that things were not as they should be. There were signs of a hurried presence, displaced items, a slight mess that suggested someone had been here without my knowledge. Every detail, from the unfamiliar scent lingering in the air to the carefully placed items in the living room, confirmed my growing suspicion. I wasn't alone. I paused, heart racing, taking in every detail, wondering who could have been here and why. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone broken in? Or was this something else entirely? The luxury jacket, the expensive cologne, and that untouched bottle of wine hinted at a scenario far beyond a simple burglary. It felt orchestrated, almost like a message left behind. Unsure of what to do next, I carefully scanned the room for any more clues. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every misplaced object was a puzzle piece to a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. My senses were on high alert, and I knew that if I didn't act quickly, I might never figure out the full story behind these mysterious signs. There, in the quiet stillness of my own home, a single thought echoed in my mind. Something was very, very wrong, and I had to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. I pushed the door open just a few more centimeters, and there it was. A sound I'd never thought I'd hear in our home. My wife's quiet laughter, lilting and unmistakably familiar. It was such a stark contrast to the tense unease that had been creeping over me since I first noticed that strange cologne. My heart pounded as I flung the door wide open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There stood Melissa, my wife of over a decade, completely exposed in nothing but a thin sheet. The sight was surreal, a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity. The soft light barely concealed every curve and contour of her body, leaving little to the imagination. My eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, darted around the room until they landed on the unexpected presence beside her. A man I'd never seen before. He was seated on the edge of our neatly made bed, shirtless and clearly unprepared for the intrusion into our private space. His expression was a mix of complete shock and helplessness, as if he had stumbled into a scene far more dramatic than he ever anticipated. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was so heavy I could almost feel it pressing in on me from all sides. Melissa's laughter, which had been so lighthearted just seconds ago, faltered as she realized I was there. Her eyes widened, and in a desperate attempt to salvage some dignity, she scrambled to cover herself further. "It's not what you think," she blurted out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and regret. The man beside her, whose name I would later learn was Nate, fumbled for words. I didn't know you were married," he stammered, his tone trying desperately to sound innocent, as if that feeble excuse could somehow explain away the betrayal unfolding before my eyes. His voice was weak and halting, each word dripping with a combination of panic and self-preservation. My mind raced, a swirl of betrayal and disbelief crashing over me. I couldn't reconcile the comforting memories of our quiet evenings together with this raw, explosive confrontation. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The past, the present, and the future all colliding into one single, shattering moment. I stood there, frozen, as Melissa's eyes pleaded with me for understanding, her body trembling in the dim light of our bedroom. Every detail, the way her hands fidgeted with the sheet, the unsteady tone of Nate's attempts at explanation, and the palpable tension in the air, spoke of secrets I had never known existed. My heart felt like it was being wrenched out of my chest, each beat echoing the betrayal I'd long suspected but never truly believed could be real. "How long?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice hoarse with raw emotion. "How long have you been doing this?" Each word was heavy with accusation and heartbreak. I needed answers, a rationale for the shattered trust and broken promises laid bare before me. Melissa's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a silent admission of guilt and regret, while Nate's face contorted into a mask of contrition, as if he were caught in the act of confessing a sin he could neither hide nor deny. For a long, agonizing moment, I couldn't move. The room itself seemed to close in around me, transforming our once safe haven into a claustrophobic space filled with whispered secrets and lies. I remembered all the late nights, the shared laughter, the quiet moments that had once defined our life together, and now they lay in ruins, casualties of a betrayal I had never seen coming. Melissa's voice broke through the heavy silence again. "Brian, please listen," she implored, her tone soft yet desperate, but her words were like whispers against the roar of my heartache. Nate tried once more to explain, his voice wavering as he repeated his excuse. "I didn't know," he began, only to be cut off by the silence that screamed louder than any argument ever could. The shock, the betrayal, and the sheer unexpectedness of it all left me numb. I felt as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. A life filled with twists and turns I'd never asked for. Every fiber of my being rebelled against the reality that lay before me. The room, with its soft lighting and once comforting familiarity, now served as the stage for a nightmare I could neither wake up from nor escape. In that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The laughter that had echoed moments ago now sounded like a cruel mockery of the trust we once shared. Every detail, the scent of expensive cologne, the misplaced wine glasses, the unmistakable luxury of the surroundings, was a painful reminder that I had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes locked on Melissa's tear-filled gaze, and felt an overwhelming need to confront the pain head-on. Yet, every part of me knew that this confrontation was only the beginning, a prelude to a story filled with more twists, secrets, and betrayals than I could ever have imagined. In that silent, heavy moment, the reality of our shattered life hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for breath, clinging desperately to the remnants of a trust that was now irreparably broken. And so, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, caught between the echoes of laughter and the unbearable weight of betrayal, I realized that the night was far from over. Each second that ticked by was a reminder that the truth, however painful, was now laid bare before me, and there was no turning back. I barely registered Nate's stammered apologies as I turned to face him with a cold, unyielding gaze. Without a flicker of emotion, or perhaps more accurately, with every ounce of the ice that had been building inside me, I ordered him to leave. "Get out," I said flatly, my voice void of any of the warmth or hesitation I once reserved for even the most difficult conversations. Nate didn't resist. His eyes widened, and he mumbled one more feeble excuse before scrambling off the bed, nearly tripping over his own feet as he made his escape from our shared space. The silence he left behind was punctuated only by the echo of his hurried footsteps as he disappeared down the hallway. I stood there, the residue of disbelief slowly morphing into a hardened resolve. My heart pounded in a rhythm of betrayal and heartbreak, yet the shock had been replaced by a numbing detachment. The room, with its disheveled state and the remnants of intimacy that no longer belonged to me, felt surreal. In the stark, unfiltered clarity of that moment, nothing seemed to matter except the overwhelming need to reclaim my dignity. Melissa, still clad in nothing but the sheet that barely concealed her vulnerability, turned her eyes to me. Instead of the guilt or tear-stained remorse I might have expected, there was only annoyance flickering across her features. Her posture, relaxed and almost nonchalant, suggested that this was not an act of betrayal in her eyes but rather an inconvenience, a disruption to her plans. "Really, Brian, you came home so early," she said, her tone laced with irritation as if I had somehow intruded upon her fun. "It wasn't a big deal, just some fun. Nothing serious." Her words struck me like a final, crushing blow. To her, this entire situation was trivial, a fleeting dalliance, a moment of excitement that hardly warranted the pain and turmoil that now consumed me. There was no remorse, no sense of responsibility in her voice, only a dismissive nonchalance that seemed to erase every emotion I once associated with the life we had built together. The casual indifference in her eyes made the reality of the betrayal all the more unbearable. I could feel the weight of every second dragging on, every minute that I stood there etching a clearer picture of a relationship that was irreparably fractured. My mind raced, dissecting every conversation, every laugh, every shared secret that had led me to this moment. A moment where love had turned to something unrecognizable. I realized that while I had clung desperately to the remnants of trust and connection, Melissa had already moved on, treating our marriage like a mere inconvenience in her pursuit of fleeting pleasure. In that moment, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. I took a slow, deliberate step back, the distance between us growing as my resolve solidified. "That's enough," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I didn't wait for another word, for another attempt to brush aside the betrayal. Every second of silence, Every look exchanged between us confirmed what I already knew. I could no longer stay in a place where I was so utterly unvalued. Without a backward glance, I turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling both like a punishment and a liberation. I gathered my things methodically, my mind a whirl of memories, regrets, and the painful clarity of truth. The apartment that once held the warmth of shared moments now reeked of betrayal and indifference, a space that no longer belonged to me. With every step toward the door, I felt a small measure of freedom, a slow, dawning realization that I was finally reclaiming my life from a love that had long since turned toxic. I paused at the threshold, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me, but also the promise of a future where I could heal, rebuild, and rediscover who I was without the constant shadow of betrayal. The door closed softly behind me, marking the end of one chapter and the painful beginning of another. Outside, the night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the apartment I was leaving behind. In that quiet, solitary moment, I acknowledged the magnitude of the decision I had made. It wasn't just a physical departure. It was the irrevocable severing of ties that had once defined my identity. I walked away with nothing but the echo of Melissa's dismissive words and the bitter taste of betrayal lingering in my mouth. And as I stepped into the darkness of the night, I couldn't help but feel that, somewhere amid the pain and uncertainty, lay the first true step toward reclaiming my life, one decision at a time. I drove out of the neighborhood in a daze, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and sorrow. The city lights blurred past as I tried to distance myself from the nightmare that had just unfolded at home. I knew I needed to clear my head, to escape the suffocating betrayal, even if only for a little while. After a few minutes on the road, I spotted a gas station about 10 miles from my house, a small, brightly lit haven in the middle of the night. I pulled in, parked under the neon glow of flickering signs, and sat in the car trying to make sense of the events that had shattered my world. It wasn't long before the weight of isolation began to press down on me. I felt utterly alone and in desperate need of a familiar voice, someone who could offer not just comfort, but also a sense of direction. Without thinking twice, I reached for my phone and dialed Lucas's number. His voice answered almost immediately, and I barely had time to explain the situation before he was listening intently. The moment he heard what had happened, the sight of Melissa, the shock on Nate's face, the betrayal in every detail of that scene. There was a pause, then a fierce silence that conveyed everything I couldn't say aloud. Within minutes, Lucas was already on his way. I could hear the engine of his car roaring as he drove toward me, the sound of his urgency crackling over the phone line. I sat there, the cool night air seeping through the cracked window, and tried to steady my trembling hands. Every second felt stretched out, like an eternity between my call and his arrival. I kept glancing at the entrance to the station, wondering when the one person I could still trust would show up. And then I saw him, Lucas's car pulling into the parking lot, headlights cutting through the darkness. The moment he stepped out, I could sense his fury radiating from him like heat. It wasn't just anger. It was a raw, palpable force of protective instinct. As he strode toward my car, his eyes blazed with a mix of indignation and sorrow, a silent promise that he wouldn't let this betrayal go unchallenged. "Brian," he barked as soon as he reached the driver's side, his tone laced with both concern and barely contained rage. I barely had time to open the door and let him in before he began interrogating me about every detail. Every single moment leading up to the discovery, every word that had been exchanged in that room filled with shattered trust. His presence was overwhelming. It was as if his fury alone was trying to expunge the lingering sense of betrayal that clung to me like a second skin. Lucas didn't waste any time letting me know that our next move was non-negotiable. "We're going back there," he declared firmly, without giving me a moment to protest or hesitate. "You're not leaving your stuff behind, and you're not going to let her." His voice trailed off, a mix of anger and protective concern filling his words. He was adamant. We were supposed to come back for my things that same night, no matter how painful it was to retrieve the remnants of what I once called home. I tried to argue, to explain that I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet, but Lucas's eyes narrowed in determination. He didn't want to hear any of it. "Now's not the time for your second-guessing, Brian," he said, his voice a forceful reminder of the man I had always known to be my rock. "We're leaving now and getting your stuff. You need to take back control of this situation, and I'm not letting you wallow here any longer." As we drove out of the gas station, Lucas's silence in the passenger seat was as heavy as the anger that simmered beneath the surface. Every mile we put between the gas station and my house was filled with a mix of tension and a strange, comforting certainty that, together, we could face whatever came next. His unwavering determination was a stark contrast to the emptiness I had been feeling, and I clung to that strength as if it were a lifeline. On the drive back, Lucas's words kept echoing in my ears. He reminded me that this wasn't just about retrieving material belongings. It was about reclaiming my sense of self after being so brutally betrayed. "We're going to set things straight," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You deserve to know that you're worth more than this mess, and I'm not going to let anyone, especially not her, take that away from you." Despite the lingering shock and the bitterness of betrayal, I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for my brother's unwavering support. His fury wasn't just anger. It was a shield, a protective force that made me feel less alone in the midst of chaos. And even though I knew the confrontation ahead would be painful, having Lucas by my side filled me with a resolve I hadn't felt since that fateful night. By the time we neared my house, the reality of our situation was unavoidable. Lucas's presence, his relentless determination to reclaim what had been lost, was a testament to the bond we shared, a bond that, despite everything, remained unbroken. As we prepared to step back into the nightmare I'd left behind, I took a deep breath, knowing that with Lucas's support, I might just have the strength to face the wreckage of my shattered life. When we pulled up to the house, the tension I'd been carrying seemed to spike even higher. I could already see Melissa waiting for us on the front porch, her smile taunting and smug under the porch light. It was as if she believed I'd had a change of heart, that I'd somehow decided to forgive her, the very thought igniting a further surge of bitterness inside me. Lucas and I stepped out of the car in silence. I could almost hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as we made our way to the door. Melissa's eyes glittered with an unsettling mix of amusement and self-assurance as she greeted us. "Oh, so you've come back," she purred, a note of derision in her tone. It was clear she had concocted some twisted narrative in her mind, that my decision to leave had been nothing more than a momentary lapse, that I'd simply changed my mind. I couldn't stand to hear another word of it. Without a word, I made my way straight to my room, my back stiff with the weight of betrayal and resolve. I didn't pause to meet her gaze. Every step was calculated and deliberate as I began to gather the remnants of my life. Clothes, personal items, memories I'd once treasured. The act of packing became almost therapeutic in its finality. Each piece of clothing or memento a symbol of what was lost and what I was leaving behind. Lucas, ever the guardian and my unwavering pillar of strength, followed close behind. As I methodically folded a shirt and placed it into a worn duffel bag, I heard him call out sharply, "Don't play dumb, Melissa. There's no way you think Brian's coming back to this mess." His words cut through the stale air of the hallway, a verbal accusation that reverberated with the truth of our shared reality. It wasn't just an attack on her character, it was an irrefutable condemnation of the life we had been forced to live. Melissa's smile faltered for an instant, replaced by a flash of anger before she quickly masked it with another smug expression. I didn't spare her a second glance. Instead, I continued to pack, my movements growing more determined with every passing moment. It was as if I were shedding the last vestiges of a life that had been poisoned by deceit and neglect. The lingering scent of that expensive, foreign cologne in the bedroom was the final straw, a cruel reminder that I had been intruded upon in every sense of the word. I paused for a moment, letting the smell wash over me like a burning brand of betrayal. I could feel the acrid tang of it fueling my resolve, hardening my heart against any lingering hope for reconciliation. Lucas and I worked in near silence now, the only sounds the rustling of fabric and the soft clatter of items being thrown into a bag. I barely registered the muted protests from Melissa, whose eyes darted between us with a desperate attempt to regain some control over the situation. It was laughable. Her belief that I'd somehow wavered in my decision was utterly disconnected from the reality that unfolded before us. In what felt like a final, synchronized act of liberation, Lucas and I exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement that this was it. There was nothing left to salvage, no compromise to be found in the ashes of our shattered trust. We quickly finished packing up the remaining items, each second carrying us closer to the end of this torturous chapter. Before we left, I took one last look at the house, its walls now echoing with memories that had turned bitter and hollow. I felt a surge of relief mingled with a lingering sadness, knowing that I was walking away from a part of my life that had once defined me. Lucas's presence beside me was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, I was not alone. Together, we carried the weight of the betrayal out the door, every step forward a promise to rebuild a life free from lies. With one final, resolute glance at the place that had once been my home, we stepped out into the cool night air. The door closed behind us with a definitive finality, sealing away the remnants of a past that no longer held any power over me. In that moment, as we drove away from the house, I felt an unfamiliar lightness, a slow but sure realization that sometimes the hardest part of letting go is also the first step toward finding yourself again. After leaving the chaos behind, we drove another 35 miles to Lucas's place, a modest refuge that, tonight, radiated safety like a beacon. The familiar comfort of his home was a welcome contrast to the cold, brittle walls I just fled. For the first time in what felt like forever, I experienced a sense of security and calm, the weight of betrayal temporarily lifted by the quiet sanctuary that awaited me. Lucas parked his car and we trudged up the steps together. As soon as we stepped inside, he wasted no time. With a practiced motion, he cracked open a beer and took a long, satisfying swig before setting it down on the table. He turned to me, eyes searching for answers, and asked, "What now?" His voice was a mixture of concern and the unspoken hope that maybe, somehow, everything could be set right. I paused in the middle of the silence, the taste of freedom and bittersweet relief mingling on my tongue. I looked around at the familiar, comforting clutter of Lucas's living room, a stark contrast to the sterile remnants of my shattered home life. Then, with a slow, resolute smile creeping across my face, I answered in one word, "Divorce." The single word hung in the air, carrying with it the culmination of a decade of suppressed pain and unresolved betrayal. It was more than a statement, it was a declaration of emancipation. My hands slipped into my pocket almost instinctively, and I pulled out my phone. With a trembling determination, I scrolled through my contacts until I found our lawyer's number. I pressed call, feeling as if I were dialing into a new chapter of my life, one that promised true liberation from the confines of a loveless, deceit-riddled marriage. As the phone rang, each tone resonated with my newfound resolve. It was surreal to think that after 10 years of compromising and quiet suffering, I was finally taking the first definitive step toward reclaiming my freedom. The familiar anxiety that had plagued me for so long was slowly being replaced by a quiet certainty, a belief that I deserved a life unburdened by the lies and betrayals of the past. Lucas's supportive gaze met mine as I spoke with the lawyer, and he raised his beer in a silent, understanding toast. The unspoken bond between us filled the room with a comforting warmth, a shared acknowledgement of the trials we'd both endured. In that moment, his presence wasn't just reassuring. It was a testament to the power of unwavering support and brotherhood. Sitting there in Lucas's living room, surrounded by a sense of safety and hope, I allowed myself to savor the irony of it all. The man who'd once been tethered to a life defined by routine, obligation, and hidden pain was now poised to embrace a future of authenticity and possibility. The call to the lawyer marked more than just the end of my marriage. It signified the start of a journey toward rediscovering who I truly was, unencumbered by the betrayals that had once confined me. In that quiet moment, as I listened to the lawyer confirm the next steps, I realized that true freedom wasn't about erasing the past. It was about having the courage to move forward despite it. The dark chapter of my life was closing, and with it, the promise of a future filled with endless potential. For the first time in 10 long years, I felt the exhilarating rush of liberation coursing through me. It wasn't an escape from pain. It was the bold, unfiltered embrace of a new beginning. With Lucas by my side, I knew that I wasn't just walking away from a marriage. I was stepping into a life where every decision was mine to make, every hope mine to nurture. As the call connected and plans were set in motion, the reality of my decision settled in. I was done with a life that had been riddled with deceit and heartache. I was ready to face the future on my own terms, guided by a newfound strength and the unwavering support of my brother. That night, under the soft glow of Lucas's living room lamp, I tasted true freedom. A freedom that promised not just an end, but a thrilling, unpredictable beginning.